Hello, Theology and Science Learning community. This is Dave Opterbeck, and we are in this video going to continue our discussion and finish our discussion of historical backgrounds. And if you remember from the previous video, we kind of led up through the Scholastic period in the Middle Ages, and we said that in early Christian thought, in patristic Christian thought, and in early scholastic Christian thought, creation was viewed as a kind of sacrament, as a sign of the presence of God, and the understanding of the relationship between God and creation was what we call a participatory relationship, not a mechanistic relationship. And we asked, how did this begin to change in the modern period? So we're going to very briefly, and again, as we do these videos on history, we're omitting a lot of things, and we have to try and be as efficient as we can. But we're going to try and talk a little bit about how in the modern period we've really gotten away from that sense as creation as sacramental. And we'll see that this does coincide in many ways with what we call the scientific revolution. Now, one part of the story could be that the scientific revolution, in becoming scientific, displaced the older religious view. And there might be some truth in that. But I think the story is a lot more complicated intellectually. Obviously, there was an enormous amount gained through what we call the scientific revolution. The advances in modern technology and modern medicine and our understanding of the history of the natural world are just astonishing and rapid in history, and these are things that, of course, we are very, very grateful for. But at the same time, I want to suggest that some things were lost in our intellectual imagination, in our spiritual imagination. We have previously looked at the earlier periods in history. We talked about the apostolic period, when the documents of the New Testament, that become the documents of the New Testament, are first constructed. We talked about the patristic period, and we began to talk about the medieval period and scholasticism in the medieval period. And now we're going to move into the later parts of scholasticism, later medieval period, which then begins to move into the Renaissance era and begins to move into the early modern era. And as you can see, this will encompass both the later Middle Ages and the Protestant Reformation. And we want to talk a little bit about the effect of the Protestant Reformation and other events around that. So first, I want to tell a part of the story that is often maybe not told, which is the later scholastic period. And we've talked about Thomas Aquinas and Aquinas's understanding of God as being itself, and Aquinas as drawing on Aristotle and also on Plato. And in the later scholastic period, there's a lot of debate about Aquinas' works. In fact, at some times and places, parts of Aquinas' works are actually banned by the Catholic Church, even though today they're viewed as sort of the premium kind of works for the Catholic Church. But there were some other thinkers in that period who are important for us. And I want to tell you that this part of this discussion is a contested thing historically and is a contested thing in theological circles. There is no doubt, though, that these thinkers were important. So we're going to focus on two, John Duns Scotus and William of Ockham. And what Scotus and Ockham are doing is looking at in part what they're doing is they're looking at the works of Aquinas, and they're wondering if Aquinas is, in his use of analogical reasoning, his use of analogy, is getting so far away in discussing God that we really aren't able to have any knowledge of God. And they're further looking at the natural world, and they're wondering if some of the Aristotelian aspects of how Aquinas is discussing the natural world are really adequate to the understanding of the natural world. And in doing that, they begin, and Scotus especially begins to talk about, instead of using analogy, using a method of reasoning that he's calling univocity. So remember that analogy is saying we can speak of God using human language that gives us real understanding, but the language is always analogical. So if I say God is good, I may be thinking, or God is a good father, I may be thinking analogically of what a good human father is like, and that gives me some knowledge of God, but God is always infinitely exceeding that. I'm not speaking directly of God. And Scotus wants to say, no, actually, our language can speak more directly of God. Analogy gets too far away. And he uses this term univocity, right? So uni, right? It's one, it's closer language. And he speaks then of the univocity of being, where Aquinas is talking about God as being in itself, and then is kind of with Aristotle and Plato thinking of different layers of being. Scotus wants to collapse that a little bit. And Occam likewise does the same thing. You may have heard the term Occam's razor, and in a later lecture we're going to talk a little bit about what Occam's razor means in kind of the modern philosophy of science. But Occam's razor in Occam's own original context was that he said we should not multiply universals unnecessarily. All right, so I know that's a mouthful, but if you remember a little bit some of our previous discussion of Plato and Aristotle, but Plato in particular, so a universal and the particular. Right, so if we think of something like what is, let's just say this is a bucket of water, right? I have here water. I have a particular instance of water. How do I relate this to the broader concept of water in general? And in particular, how do I say, is this instance of water good, or is it polluted? Is it bad? Right? I'm referring to some universal concept of water. And if we continue to do that, we can think of all different sorts of universals. Maybe there's waterness, maybe there's personness, maybe there's horseness, and people like Scotus and Occam are saying, and this gets very, very in-depth in different aspects of medieval scholastic philosophy, but they start to say, you're making up all these universals and it's just getting too complicated. And Occam wants to say, don't multiply them unnecessarily. Now, Occam wouldn't say get rid of universals, but he would say don't multiply them unnecessarily. So you can see that Scotus and Occam are concerned with a few things. They're concerned with philosophy that's getting so abstract it doesn't really seem to be describing anything. And they are also getting concerned with how we speak directly of God's action in nature. And they're also getting concerned with the nature of God's freedom. It can seem sometimes if we speak of God as being itself and as creation participating in God's being, it can start to seem like creation is maybe necessary, or that the way creation is perhaps is necessary, or that perhaps certain of God's commands are necessary in one way or the other. And Scotus and Occam want to reaffirm that God in fact is completely free and creation is completely contingent. So there are some good aspects of Scotus and Occam's thought, and there are theologians today who think Scotus and Occam were very much on the right track, and there are other theologians today, including myself, who think that Scotus and Occam had some good insights, but that in getting away from speaking of analogy, they began to kind of collapse God into the particular, collapse God, in a sense, into just like another creature or another being within creation. That's certainly not anything that Scotus and Occam would have wanted to do. They would have thought that to be blasphemous. But there is perhaps an intellectual tendency to do that. And with that, there are these other tendencies, voluntarism and nominalism. And voluntarism is the notion that is the question about God's will and God's being. So in the classical metaphysics of someone like Aquinas and someone like Augustine, for example, God's being precedes God's will. God's will flows from God's being. Voluntarism begins to suggest that will comes first, that God's will is primary, that God's being flows from God's will, that God determines God's self for whom God wants to be. And again, this seems like a very subtle debate, and it is a very subtle debate. And there are some interesting questions that it raises. But if God's will precedes God's being, it does preserve the freedom, the contingency of creation, but it does also seem to suggest that creation is arbitrary, and that also God's commands are arbitrary. In fact, Occam wrote quite a bit about God's commands, about God's law. And Occam actually even suggested that if God were to command us to pillage and murder and rape, that command would be good. We'd have to acknowledge then that pillage and murder and rape are good. And that's a kind of fruit of suggesting that God's will precedes God's being. Now, that sounds crazy to say, and Occam would have said that's not something God commands us. It is, though, kind of rooted in some long-standing observations, things that Aquinas, of course, noticed as well, that at times God does command things that seem contrary to other commands that seem more fundamental. So, for example, in the classic example, the Scholastics would debate, and that we can still debate today, God commanded Abraham to sacrifice Isaac in that famous story in the Bible. But of course, murder is wrong. Human sacrifice would be wrong according to the Ten Commandments. So in doing that, what is God doing? How is God commanding something that is contrary to the basic moral law in the Ten Commandments? Now, if you're someone like Occam, you'd say, well, in God's will, he can do that. And if God does that, then that is good, at least in that instance. If you're someone like Aquinas, and I would tend to be more in the camp of Aquinas here, you would have to talk more broadly about the basic principles of natural law, and then about the specific applications of positive law or even positive divine commands in specific circumstances. And of course, we'd also have to, in that instance of Abraham sacrificing Isaac, we'd have to talk more broadly about God's ultimate purposes and the kind of rescinding of that command when the ram is supplied instead. But it's obviously an interesting and difficult question. So if will starts to come before being, if God starts to seem like just another creature in the universe, there's at least an intellectual climate that potentially can bear fruit later on in kind of misunderstanding what we talk about when we talk about God's providence and God's causality. If we can really fast forward to the modern period, if you have someone, one of the new atheists like Richard Dawkins, for example, and if you make an argument from causation, God is the first cause of the universe, and then Dawkins will laugh and say, well, who caused God? And in a sense, if God is just another being within the universe, that's a fair argument. If God, in fact, is transcendent of the universe, it completely misunderstands the nature of God and what we're talking about when we talk about cause. But to make that argument, I think we need to go behind some of this univocity and voluntarism and nominalism to get back toward the older medieval and older patristic understandings of God's relation to creation. Now, other people in theology and science, other theologians would disagree, and that's a lively discussion within the field. And the last piece here is nominalism, and nominalism is a question about the way words work and the way human language works. And again, it all relates to this issue of the ability of analogy as human speech to talk about God and about God's relation to creation. So for someone like Aquinas, analogy has real meaning. And of course, the actual human words that we're using, the word father, is just a set of sounds. We could say pater in some other language. I think that's the Latin. It's just a set of sounds. The sounds are arbitrary in a sense, but the concepts that the sounds signify are real, and there's some kind of real link between those things. And nominalism tends to say that names really have no meaning. And this goes back also to this discussion of universals in particular. So if I talk of water, Obviously, the sound, the word, the letters water are kind of arbitrary, but the intellectual concept, in fact, refers back to a universal, to waterness, right? But the nominalists would tend to say, no, it's just an arbitrary concept. It doesn't necessarily refer to a universal. And again, all of this, really, if you want to take just one thing away, is there a tendency to kind of squash God and creation together? Is there a tendency to kind of squash this sacramentality of creation? And perhaps there is. All right, so we spend a bit of time now talking about this late medieval period, and I want to go quickly into some later periods and just some little bits and pieces of their significance. Obviously, all of these things, volumes of books have been written. We could spend an entire spring of videos talking about all of them, but we have to move a little quickly. So we do then, in this late medieval period, move into this period that we call the Renaissance. And a couple of developments that are important for the development of science, ultimately for the scientific revolution, and for our discussion of theology and science. And I'm just going to name a few figures and movements. So this one figure I'm naming here, Petrarch, is one of the great Renaissance humanists. And the thing that I think for our purpose is significant about someone like Petrarch is he signifies this focus in the Enlightenment period on ancient texts, ancient narratives and stories, and the recovery, particularly of Greek and Roman ancient texts, and trying to understand the actual language, trying to understand the actual development of the text, and trying to understand the kind of historical meaning of the text. And that is going to begin to filter into the way we understand the Bible. So we, in the ancient view, in the kind of medieval view and the patristic view, the Bible has multiple layers. We're going to talk more about this when we specifically cover the creation narratives in a few weeks. But the Bible has multiple layers, and in some ways the layer of metaphor can be more important than the literal layer. And this recovery of ancient texts in the Renaissance, not just the Bible, but other ancient texts, focuses more on kind of the literal sense and the development of the text. All right, and then we have someone like Leonardo da Vinci. This is da Vinci's famous Vitruvian Man drawing, and you notice the realism of da Vinci's drawing of the man. And in earlier medieval art, in earlier Byzantine type art, you don't have this kind of realism. So there's a much more of a focus on the actual structures of things in nature, and in particular on the actual structure of the human being. And this is kind of a new focus on things as they are, as they present themselves to us in the real world. At the same time, we have the age of discovery. So here in 1492, right? Remember 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So of course we call this the age of discovery. I'm putting this in scare quotes very intentionally because there were people living in all of the places and sophisticated cultures in all of the places that Europeans found. So the Europeans, of course, did not discover South America or North America. But from the European perspective, they were discovering something they didn't know about. And one of the things that really starts to shake up society is the realization that there are parts of the world that nobody knew about and nobody expected to exist, and that there are other human beings with other languages and other cultures that nobody knew about and nobody expected to exist. It really does start to shake up the settled understanding of the order of the world. And this shaking up of the understanding of the order of the world is part of what is leading into, out of the medieval period into the modern period. And then, of course, we have the Protestant Reformation. Now, I put literalism here in kind of scare quotes with a question mark, and if you've read the Oliver book carefully, and I hope you have, it's a fantastic book, you'll notice that Oliver really blows very quickly over the Reformation and suggests that there's a real problem with the reformers, in particular the magisterial reformers like Luther and Calvin, of reading the Bible more literally. And certainly Luther and Calvin did read the Bible more literally than the medieval scholastics and more literally than the church fathers. As I said, and we'll come back to this when we talk about, in a couple of weeks, Genesis 1 to 11 in some detail. In the scholastic view and the patristic view, there are multiple senses of Scripture. So there is a little literal sense, but on top of that, there are these other senses, and this metaphorical sense might be more important. And part of what the reformers are doing, and it's a big part of what Luther does in his criticism of the Catholic Church in his time, is to say that the church authorities and church scholars have used these so-called higher senses to kind of obscure the basic meaning of the text. For Luther, this was his discussion of the meaning of justification in the New Testament, and particularly in Paul, in Romans, and in Galatians. And so Luther's argument is, this really allows some elites to control the meaning, and instead we should get back to this literal sense. Now, in saying that, it really isn't fair, I think, to say that Luther or Calvin were literalists in the same sense as, say, a contemporary fundamentalist Christian literalist might be. Certainly Luther and Calvin wouldn't have had any reason to sort of question the basic historicity of, say, Genesis 1 and 2. But their readings were much more sophisticated than simply that. I think particularly Calvin's. Calvin had a sophisticated doctrine that he called accommodation. Sorry, I'm trying to write with my mouse, which doesn't work very well. But he recognized that there were places in Scripture that the language that is being used it must be not literal. So, in Genesis 2, when it said God is walking through the garden, God doesn't have legs and God doesn't walk, right? So there's some sense in which that is accommodating to human understanding. And I think also likewise Luther. I've been reading a lot of Luther lately. I've been reading his commentary on Galatians, his lectures on Galatians, which are just have these incredibly brilliant insights, and then veer off into crazy attacks on the Anabaptists as well as on the Catholics, and that's just Luther. But a lot of insight. I wouldn't just lump them with modern fundamentalists. We can talk more about this when we get into our discussion of Genesis 1 through 11. But it is fair to say that Luther and Calvin, in their own way, they're influenced by the Renaissance humanists, even though Luther, has an ongoing and bitter dispute with Erasmus, one of the leading Renaissance humanists. Still, in their focus on the text, I think they're very much influenced by the Renaissance humanists. But it is also true that they were influenced by the themes of nominalism and of voluntarism that had been part of the discourse among the later medieval scholastics. Now, Luther was critical of Scotus, just as he was very, very critical of Aquinas. But I think it's very fair to say that there's a real question whether in Luther and in Calvin, God's will does precede God's being, and those are kind of big discussions and kind of an interesting question to talk about. All right, so we have now kind of moved through 1700, 1500 years of history, and we are going to move further into what we call the modern period. And you can see in this little map here, there's a lot of things that happen. We have the Protestant Reformation, and then we have the Catholic Counter-Reformation, and there's quite a bit of back and forth that happens in that, and intellectual back and forth. And then the disputes of the Reformation, along with political disputes that are facilitated or that different political factions take advantage of lead to the 30 Years' War, which is, in sort of absolute terms, or proportionate terms, still the most brutal and bloody war in the history of Europe, and that includes World War I and World War II. Of course, World War I and II on an absolute scale are much bigger. There's much more destruction and death, absolutely, and because the population was much bigger. But in proportionate terms, the 30 Years' War was actually more devastating. And really, after the 30 Years' War, at the conclusion of the 30 Years' War, you have the Peace of Westphalia. And the Peace of Westphalia really begins the modern era of the nation-state. Around this same time, we have the beginnings of the scientific revolution. And a little later, in the 18th century, we have the age of political revolution, which includes the American Revolution. And in this whole stretch, we call this the age of Enlightenment. Now, you'll imagine that for our discussion here, this idea of the age of Enlightenment is going to be a very freighted concept. Certainly, we would think of, I think, the scientific revolution as a kind of enlightening, right, a kind of broader knowledge. Certainly, we would think of, I think, some aspects of the age of political revolution. I teach constitutional law. As a kind of Christian legal scholar, I have a very fraught relationship with modern liberalism. Liberalism meaning, capital L liberalism, not today's conservative versus liberal, but the idea that there are individual rights and constitutional governance. I think all of those things are very valuable. The way they work out does raise real questions about our theological understanding of the world, but we have all of that happening. And all of this will eventually lead up to kind of the verge of what we're trying, the fallout from which we're trying to deal with now, which is on the Protestant side, the Fundamentalist Modernist controversy. On the Catholic side, we'll sort of leave off with something called the Syllabus of Errors. All right, so let's talk about this a little bit. As we're moving into modernity, we're gonna step back a little bit before modernity and look at some beginnings of some scientific revolutions that are also cultural and intellectual revolutions. And one of the key ones is the Copernican Revolution. So we have Copernicus here. Maybe you'll recall this from, a high school history class or something, but the traditional view held for almost 1,500 years, was that the Earth was at the center of the universe. And the stars and the planets revolved around the Earth. And here we have Copernicus's drawing, suggesting that, based on his mathematical calculations, it must be the sun that is at the center of the solar system. And, as Copernicus is kind of discussing this idea mathematically, it's thought of as a theory, and it's thought of as not a very likely theory, because the Aristotelian worldview with the Earth at the center is adopted and supported by the theological establishment and its interpretation of the Bible to say that the Earth must be at the center, but Copernicus puts the idea out there. We have another kind of beginning of cracks in the facade of the Aristotelian understanding of the cosmos, with things like Tycho Brahe observing a supernova. So an early astronomer, we would say, and Brahe is observing a group of stars and notices that there's one star in the group that has suddenly become much brighter than it was before. Now, Brahe doesn't know what we know today, that is the result of a supernova, of an explosion in the star, of the explosion of the star. But the reason it was really earth-shattering is, in the Aristotelian view, stars are kinds of entities that don't change. And so to observe change in a star really starts to shake up this idea that the Earth is the center of a set of spheres of the heavens, and that those spheres of the heavens, the individual bodies within the spheres of the heavens, don't change. In 1608 is the invention of the telescope. Galileo did not invent the telescope, but it was invented, and then Galileo perfects the telescope, and then Galileo makes observations using the telescope that he argues correctly confirm Copernicus's theory that in fact the sun must be the center of the solar system. And these are Galileo's drawings. If you've ever looked at Jupiter through a decent telescope on a decent night, and if you haven't, you need to do that because it's really cool. But if you have, you will recognize these drawings. So here is Jupiter, and you can see in the telescope what look like little stars arrayed in lines or in other patterns around Jupiter, which are, we know today, Jupiter's moons. And as Galileo observes Jupiter's moons on different days, he sees that these objects are changing their position around Jupiter, and he infers these must be objects orbiting Jupiter. If these objects are orbiting Jupiter, they are not themselves orbiting the Earth. They're not themselves orbiting the Earth. And now there are some possible explanations that some defenders of the Aristotelian view would have come up with, which is, you have the Earth, and then you have different planets, and then you might have some of the planets orbiting other planets in what they called epicycles, but still orbiting the Earth. But when the planets then have objects, moons, orbiting them and other epicycles that would also be orbiting the Earth, it gets so complicated that it's really impossible to sustain mathematically. So using the telescope, and this is something to notice, and you'll see a few more things in the rest of this lecture like this, the development of instruments that allow human beings to peer further out into the heavens and also further down into the microscopic level, the telescope and the microscope, and make those observations really challenges these sort of traditional views. So famously, as you probably know, Galileo is put on trial by the church for heresy, for arguing that the sun is in fact the center of the solar system. So as you probably know, Galileo is put on trial by the church for heresy, and Galileo ultimately is convicted in this trial. And this is part of the decree of the church. The proposition that the sun is the center of the world is absurd and false, philosophically and formally heretical, because it is expressly contrary to Holy Scripture. The reference here is to the biblical story of Joshua's long day. And Joshua's long day is a story in which God, as the story tells it, God makes the sun stand still in order to facilitate a battle. So if the sun stands still, the reasoning was the sun can't be the center. It must be moving around the earth. And again, philosophically and theologically erroneous in faith. Now, this is one of the kind of key moments in anyone who is arguing that there must be warfare between science and religion. And it certainly is not a happy moment for the relationship between science and religion because, of course, we know that the sun is the center of the solar system and Galileo was right. But you need to look a little more deeply into the nuance of the story if you're really interested in it. And the fact is that there were personalities involved. Galileo had a really acerbic personality. The Pope at the time had a difficult personality. There were a lot of different politics involved. It could have been possible, perhaps, for Galileo to simply acknowledge that what he was propounding was a kind of theory that merited discussion, and that perhaps might have allowed the discussion to continue and might have avoided the censure of the church, but Galileo wasn't willing to do that for a bunch of different reasons. Now, of course, as we look back on this now, we might say, well, that's ridiculous. Galileo shouldn't have to do that, but you have to put yourself back into the context of the 17th century. And of course, not too long after this, the Catholic Church did have to acknowledge that Galileo was right. So, but we do have this kind of challenge to this Aristotelian worldview. And then we begin to have the start of the makings of the modern scientific method. Francis Bacon is an important figure here and publishes a book called Novum Organum. And what Bacon is talking about here is when we are looking at the natural world, what we should be doing is making observations of the world, conducting experiments, and then using inductive reasoning to say, based on those observations and experiments, what seems to be correct. Now, one of the things that Bacon's method is extraordinarily successful, and of course we recognize it as part of a way we would describe the scientific method today. But one of the things that potentially is problematic, at least from my perspective of what Bacon is doing, is that it's removing from the discussion formal and final causes. Remember, for Aristotle, we have formal causes, we have material cause, we have the efficient cause, and we have the final cause. Now, it may be as a method of simply trying to describe a type of causality, like the kind of causality that Aquinas would have called secondary causality. Perhaps this is useful, and it is useful and important. But at the same time, perhaps in removing the final and formal causes, it becomes easier and easier to see God or to see the theological explanation as something completely unnecessary. That wasn't Bacon's intent. Bacon was a Christian. He believed that what he was doing was understanding the nature of God's creation, but it is an important kind of movement. We have some other philosophical developments that are useful for us to talk about, and this is René Descartes. And Descartes in 1641 publishes his Meditations on First Philosophy. You might, if you know Descartes at all, you might recognize this phrase, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. The important thing for our purpose for Descartes is he is trying to come up with a way of having certain knowledge, including certain knowledge, certainty of the existence of God. And the method that he comes up with is a method of radical doubt. So he says, I'm going to doubt everything, and I'm going to see from that position of doubting everything whether I, through my intellectual activity, can come up with a framework or a foundation for certainty. This idea of a foundation is something in contemporary philosophy that we talk about as foundationalism. And in doing that, one of Descartes' first observations was that he was thinking, and that if he is thinking, he must exist. And, kind of from that fact of reflecting on his own existence, he goes out and builds a epistemology, a way of knowing that includes his sensory knowledge, and then that includes what he thinks are proofs of the existence of God. Descartes also is famous for a distinction he makes between mind and body, and we call this Cartesian from Descartes dualism. So Descartes thinks that the mind must be a substance that is distinct from the body. He did think that the mind is located within a structure within the body. He thought it was actually within the pineal gland, but he thought it must be a substance separate from the body. Now you might think to yourself, well, all right, so didn't Aquinas think something like that? No, not really. The classical view was that the mind and the body are distinct but united. So the Cartesian method really creates a separation. So there's a few things, and Descartes was a brilliant thinker, but there are a few things that lead to some, again, of this kind of modern separation of theology or philosophy or God from what we call science. This method of radical doubt and the notion that only what is knowable through sensory knowledge and this kind of rational thinking, this kind of rational way of structuring things, this distinction between mind and body, eventually in which the kind of ethereal piece can sort of go away, and we're really focused only on the physical piece, to the point that many modern neuroscientists think there's no such thing as mind at all. It's really just an epiphenomenal illusion based on the brain, right? These kinds of things kind of reverberate into the modern period. In the middle of the 17th century, we have Robert Boyle and the start of modern chemistry. You might remember Boyle's law from a high school science class. The pressure of a gas is inversely proportional to its volume, right? The more pressure, the more squished it is, so to speak. We just want to know Boyle here because it's part of the trend toward being more empirical and describing mathematically the working of nature. Also note that people like Boyle, again, they were religious people. I mean, Boyle also wrote some things that we might think were really kind of misguided, but, trying to use his kind of mathematical reasoning to try and prove the possibility of resurrection, for example. Now, an interesting thing about this is it really is kind of a trend toward trying to prove God or prove certain doctrines using more modern scientific, empirical, or mathematical methods. And we still see this today. I mean, for example, in what is called intelligent design theory, trying to use kind of mathematical methods to prove that there is a creator, who is God. From my perspective, and from the perspective of many theologians working in this space, that's a mistake. And I think it's a mistake because, again, you're taking away the notion of the formal cause and the final cause. And you're taking away the distinction between primary and secondary causality, and you're mushing together things that really don't belong mushed together. But in any event, it's a trend that comes into modernity. I mentioned scientific instruments. So in 1620, the microscope is invented. In 1665, Robert Hooke discovers the cell. So just as looking out into the heavens, there's an understanding of a vastness of the universe that wasn't known before, and workings of the universe that weren't known before. From the European perspective, quote unquote, discovering the new world, there's a vastness to human society that wasn't known before. Looking down into the microscopic world, there's a vastness in the microscopic world and life within the microscopic world that wasn't known before. All this shakes up that your Aristotelian kind of worldview. In 1667, Nicholas Steno develops the principles of stratigraphy and the theory of fossils. So people had known of the existence of fossils before Strato, but they had assumed that these were things that kind of grew in the earth. They, oddly enough, didn't think, for the most part, that they were the remains of very ancient animals. And Steno, looking at pieces of rock that have been cut away, or pieces of dirt that have been cut away, right? And as you look at a piece of rock that's been cut away, you can see the different layers, different colors of the layers of the rock. And Steno says this must reflect different eras of periods of time when different things were happening as these layers are deposited. And if we find a fossil in those layers, the inference is, well, that was an animal that must have existed in that earlier period of time. And you can recognize from this the basis of modern ideas of geology and our understanding of ancient life. Now, Steno, again, was a religious person. This is Steno later in his life. He became a Catholic bishop. So he understood what he was doing as part of his religious vocation. We have in 1675, Leeuwenhoek first observing microorganisms in a microscope, expanding that understanding. So we have the cell, and then we have microorganisms, that understanding. And then in 1687, Isaac Newton publishes his Principia Mathematica. And this is going to be really important for our discussion, especially as we think more about the modern period and the not movement away from Newton, but the gloss on Newton. So in the Principia Mathematica, Newton argues and describes the laws of classical mechanics. For example, that for every action, let's throw a ball down the aisle and it hits the pin and the pin falls over, right? There's an equal and opposite reaction, and Newton can describe that mathematically. And in Newton's view, it must be the case that all of the universe can be described according to these mathematical laws of motion, which leads to the understanding that the universe must be mechanical. The universe must be, in that sense, determined and deterministic. And we're going to see some other thinkers and some other ways of thinking even about theology and science in this period that are based on these Newtonian assumptions. Now, we know today that Newton was not entirely correct. The classical laws of physics are correct, of course, and they describe what is happening at the macro layer. But after Einstein, we also have quantum mechanics, and we know that underneath this macro layer, there are the layers of quantum mechanics which are not deterministic, but which are probabilistic. So this doesn't displace Newton, but it describes something more deeply that Newton and his contemporaries weren't aware of. Now, the kind of understanding of the Newtonian universe really supports and leads to the development in the 17th and 18th century of deism. And Matthew Tyndall in 1730, for example, publishes Christianity as Old as the Creation, which is often referred to as the deist Bible. And so the deist idea of creation is that since, as they understood, Newtonian mechanics is correct and is the only description, they didn't have quantum physics, it must be the case that the Creator set all of these laws up in the beginning, set them into motion, and then lets them run, and doesn't have further interaction with the universe. Now, you should recognize this is not a classical Christian understanding of the relationship between God and creation, but it is an understanding that comes out of this kind of Newtonian view, and it really causes disputes between more traditional Christian thinkers and the deists about how to explain things like miracles. And next week we're going to talk a little bit more about the question of miracles. Now, of course, the perspective I'm taking is not the perspective of a deist, nor would any sort of traditional Christian theologian, I think, be taking the perspective of a deist, but why not is an interesting question, and that gets back to how today we can perhaps reinvigorate some of these medieval and patristic concepts of analogy and participation and causality in a modern key. We also have some very important religious events that are going to lead into and impact the later controversies, and still impact us, certainly from the American perspective, certainly if you're an American Protestant today, which is the Great Awakenings. 1731 to 1755 is the period that we describe as the first Great Awakening. We have figures like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. And, there's at least two, if not three, waves of Great Awakenings in American history. But what are the Great Awakenings doing? They're focused much more intensely on the kind of individual piety, the individual response of faith, and similarly on the individual's ability to kind of read Scripture and have the faith impact them more directly. Now, for many of us hearing this, including for myself, those are good impulses. We want to live and encourage the individual and personal imbibing of the faith, and then have that kind of push out into how we influence the world. But we can also kind of wonder if some of that individualism becomes a little bit too, kind of a hyper individualism, and leads us to lose something perhaps, or leads us to kind of the possibility of controversies that we don't need. All right, I mentioned we are also in the era of political revolution, so we have the American Revolution in 1776, and I think for just our purposes of intellectual zeitgeist, intellectual history, what we want to take from this is the old bonds of the medieval world that tied together God and king and creation are breaking apart. Now, of course, I would not suggest that we want to go back to an old time when the church and the crown are in their own ways closely intertwined and all of that. I'm very grateful for constitutional democracy. And yet, we want to be critical enough to recognize that there are streams of this that lead us away from a more integrated understanding of the world, that lead us away from kind of a sacramental understanding of both the world and how society fits into that. In 1802, another marker we just sort of want to place down is William Paley's publication of Natural Theology, or Evidences of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity. And what Paley is doing, drawing on this Newtonian understanding of the universe, is suggesting that the universe functions something like a great mechanism. And he says, if I went into a field and I found a pocket watch lying in the field, and I looked into the mechanism and the intricacies of the gears in that pocket watch, I would know that someone must have designed that pocket watch. And likewise, he says, if I look at the intricacies of, say, an organism within creation, I likewise must say that there must be an entity that has designed that organism. Now, this was a very popular argument and remains a very popular argument, but it really begins to get impacted by Darwin, by the understanding that, in fact, the organisms within the world developed very gradually over long stretches of time from prior organisms. And Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859. And likewise, it gets impacted by the further development of geology and stratigraphy. So Lyell publishes The Principles of Geology in 1830. Lyell begins to argue for the great antiquity of the Earth, the millions of years old of the Earth, and the antiquity of organisms reflected in the fossil record. And then Darwin begins to demonstrate the mechanism of descent with modification. And these things together really start to push against the idea of the clockwork universe and the idea of someone like Paley that, if I look at, say, I capture a frog in a pond and I dissect it and I look at how intricate it is, that it's the same as finding a watch that someone designed, because we can go back into deeper time and see the development of the frog, or at least begin to think about the development of the frog in a different way that is not perhaps quite as orderly. And I want to suggest that there are certain aspects of arguments from design that can be helpful, I think, and we will talk more about those in a week or two. But this argument of design that leads to kind of modern intelligent design arguments, I think, are really misplaced. And Paley's argument is really misplaced because, again, it doesn't really take account of primary and secondary causation. It doesn't take account of formal and final causes, which is where I think someone like Thomas Aquinas is really talking about design. And it is really falsified in a way, or versions of it are really falsified in a way, by the facts of biological evolution and by the deep antiquity of the Earth. And we'll come back to some of that. So, how do some of these challenges impact the religious landscape? And remember that we're talking about epochal changes. I mean, we're going back to the Renaissance and then to the Reformation, to the reshaping of Europe, to the quote-unquote discovery of the New World, to the colonization of North America, to the age of political revolution, to the beginnings of the scientific revolution. And this causes waves in the religious landscape. On the Catholic level, in 1864, Pope Pius IX issues something called the Syllabus of Errors. And the Syllabus of Errors describes, as the name suggests, a list of things that are thought to be errors in the modern period. Now, if you are a Catholic, or if you're a Catholic scholar, you'll know that the Catholic Church, Catholic thinkers, in some ways are kind of embarrassed today by the Syllabus of Errors, have moved away from many of the positions taken in the Syllabus of Errors, but it reflects a reaction in this period. So, for example, the decrees of the Apostolic See impede the true progress of science. In other words, the Church has an authority to speak over matters of science. The Church should be separated from the state, and the state from the Church. The Catholic Church resisted the separation of Church and state. The Roman Pontiff ought to reconcile himself and come to terms with progress. Liberalism, meaning classical political liberalism, constitutionalism, and modern civilization. So, again, like I said, in later periods, certainly in the Vatican II period, some of these things have been moved back again, but I want you to see this, real tension, real struggle with how modernity is impacting the religious landscape. Within all of this, we're talking about kind of scientific changes. There are also changes, scholarly changes, in how the Bible is understood itself. And remember, I said in that period of the Renaissance, the study of texts, of documents, the study of the origins of documents, of words, begins to become important, and all of that study begins to be applied to the Bible. And a marker for this is 1882, when Julius Wellhausen publishes Prolegomena to the History of Israel. If you know anything about biblical studies, you might recognize this. So this is Wellhausen's way of describing the different strands that go into the composition of the Pentateuch, of the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And using the study of the language, using the study of some of the concepts, Wellhausen suggested that there is a source called J, the Yahwist, there is a source called P, the priestly source, and there's a source called D, the Deuteronomist. And all of these different original sources had their own sort of versions or takes on some of the different stories and narratives that become part of the Pentateuch, and that later these are stitched and edited together, and they're not entirely altogether consistent. And in particular, Moses, the individual, didn't write all of the Pentateuch directly, and that really was a contested kind of question. In some circles, that still is a really contested question. Now, I should note that biblical scholars, Old Testament scholars today, I'm getting on a little shaky ground here to say this, but probably the mainstream still adopts something like Wellhausen's theory in a pretty significantly modified form. Others have other theories, but almost all mainstream biblical scholars recognize that there are different sources within the Pentateuch and the rest of the Old Testament as a whole that are woven together. And none would seriously argue, of course, that Moses himself wrote all of the Pentateuch outside of some extremely conservative / fundamentalist circles. So this challenges traditional views of the Bible. On the Protestant side, all of these challenges lead to what we call the fundamentalist modernist controversy in the early 20th, late 19th, early 20th century. This person is Lyman Stewart. He was a wealthy businessman, and he organized a collection of essays that became published in a series of books called The Fundamentals. And the title of that series of books is where we get the term fundamentalist today. And now, from the perspective of a Christian today who is wanting to understand their faith fruitfully and honestly, there's some aspects of the fundamentals that we might say, okay, I get that. I mean, there were small L liberal scholars, kind of what we might kind of call classic Protestant liberalism, who were not only trying to understand the discoveries of modern science, who were not only trying to look into the textual origins of the Bible, but who were also, and somewhat indebted, I think, to this Newtonian worldview in a lot of ways, saying, well, there can't really be miracles. We can't really speak of Jesus being raised from the dead. We can't speak of Jesus as being divine. Those are sort of mythologies that we need to move away from if we're going to quote-unquote scientifically understand the Bible and the faith. And, I think certainly for myself, I would say, no, that is those are things we need to think more carefully about, but the core of our faith is that Jesus rose from the dead, I would suggest, and that Jesus is fully human and fully divine, and that God acts in history. So in one sense, you can understand some of what the fundamentalists are doing. But on the other hand, the fundamentalists are reacting in such a way that they can't acknowledge any of the fruits of the modern biblical scholarship. I mean, they have to argue that it must be Moses who wrote the Pentateuch, and there can't be other sources, and all of textual criticism, all of historical criticism of the Bible must be false. And likewise, for the most part, they argue that all of the developments of modern science, in particular evolution, must be false. Now, there is one exception within the fundamentals. There is an essay by someone called James Orr who suggests that, no, we don't have to be worried about Darwinism as such. It could be that God has created the world through a process of natural selection, and that might require us to reinterpret some parts of the Bible, but it's not fundamentally inconsistent. But that was really an anomaly. There were numbers of essays within the fundamentals arguing very strongly, in particular against evolution, and linking it to modernism and atheism. And you can see, right, this similar kind of reaction to modernity that you saw in the Catholic Syllabus of Errors. This leads to a real rift in American culture. I mean, there's a really interesting and also really troubling connection between Protestant fundamentalism and American culture. And some of this goes all the way back to the Great Awakenings and the fervor of the Great Awakenings. And there's a number of good books on this if you're interested. George Marsden's Fundamentalism in American Culture is one of the best. This leads to the infamous Scopes trial, the Scopes so-called monkey trial. So there's various statutes, various laws being passed in American law. It's another kind of really interesting story of the intertwining of Protestant fundamentalism and American law, banning the teaching of evolution in public schools. And one of these gets tested when this teacher, John Scopes, refuses to abide by this statute, and there is a famous trial of Scopes involving some of the best-known trial lawyers of the day. And it ends up not really so much being a trial of Scopes as being a trial of sort of fundamentalist biblicism against evolution. And by all popular accounts, the fundamentalist biblicism was made to look pretty silly in this trial. And it is sort of a turning point in which the fundamentalists kind of retreat for a while from public life. And it seems like evolution, in a sense, has defeated Christianity, or defeated at least fundamentalist kind of biblicism. And in many ways, I think, the fights and divisions in Protestant churches today, from the mainstream or mainline Protestants to the evangelicals, to the evangelical fundamentalists, and all the different parts of that, even into our politics today, owe their roots to the what I would say is the tragedy of fundamentalism and to the fundamentalist modernist period. And we'll come back to this again a little bit when we talk about Genesis 1 to 11, and I'll talk about kind of the modern young earth creationist movement, which of course is not a movement I subscribe to, but is important for us to discuss and comes from this period as well. So that is one marker. And then just on the Catholic side, I'll give another marker. Now, the history in Catholicism, I think, with the sciences and evolution is quite different than on the Protestant evangelical fundamentalist side. In 1950, Pope Pius II publishes an encyclical letter, that's a letter to the church, called Humani Generis. And in Humani Generis, he says that we can't say that evolution explains the origin of everything, and in particular, he is worried about the origin of the human body, and in particular about the origin of the human soul. And he says the Catholic faith obliges us to say that souls are created immediately by God. And there's a deep tie here in Catholic thought between the nature of the human person and the doctrine of original sin. And a very Augustinian doctrine of original sin coming from the one person, Adam, who was the first to sin. So there's a concern here about how the understanding of human evolution would impact on the doctrine of original sin. We are also going to come back in more depth to that subject more broadly in a few weeks or a month or so when we talk about theological anthropology. And it is a really interesting question. So I would say Humani Generis is kind of the high watermark of official potential Catholic, not resistance to evolution, because it wasn't suggesting that evolution can't be true, but at least some resistance to it as it impacts something like human nature. Now, I would say that over time, and particularly after the Vatican II Council, and with popes like Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict, and Pope Francis, there's really no official Catholic resistance to the basic truths of biological evolution, even of the basic truths of human evolution. There still are questions about how Catholics and Catholic theologians would kind of need to understand, in particular, human evolution in relation to their understanding of the human person and original sin. So it's not that Humani Generis has been kind of discarded, but I do think in contemporary Catholic thought it's been modified a little bit. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more as we kind of get further into the question of theological anthropology. But we're going to leave off our discussion right now of history in this place, both on the Protestant side, at least on the kind of fundamentalist, and then, leading out from fundamentalism, the kind of evangelical Protestant side, and on the traditionalist Catholic side, with trying to come to terms not only with modern natural science, but with modernity as a whole. And to me, this is really the kind of place where we still are. We still, both on the Catholic side and on the Protestant side. And on the Protestant side, I'd say, the fundamentalist side, the conservative evangelical side, and then the kind of more mainline side, and then the more liberal side, all in their own way, still reacting to modernity. And the question for me is, if we think of post-modernity, and I think that's a very misused term, but if we think of a period in which some aspects of that modern understanding from Newton and Descartes, for example, have been questioned, are there ways in which we can look back to pre-modernity, to Aquinas, to Aristotle, to Augustine, to Plato, to the Church Fathers? Not to return to those times, either culturally or scientifically, but to recover insights that perhaps we've lost and to bring them into conversation with the things we've gained from modernity. As you can see, that's really what I'm kind of excited about. But we'll continue to unwind all of that and unpack all of that as we get into some of the more specific topics that we're going to discuss throughout the rest of our time together. And the first of those is going to be next week. We begin to talk about the nature of God and the relationship of God to creation.